Okay, good morning, everybody. We'll begin.
Good morning.
Yeah, we have handouts. Maybe we can put them somewhere on that side and,
Sorry.
yeah, just,
You like how much I'm quiet when close one.
yeah. So today we have letter to Hebrews, and I want to begin with the joke that, and I want to say it's a joke because, sometimes when I don't say that it's a joke, people don't get it. So it's a joke, that godly man should produce coffee and beer. And the reason is because he brews, It's not woman's job, it's a man's job,
Got it.
I know the person who is more into wine, of course, he's like,
Pastor, didn't you tell me that it's scientifically proven that women have smaller,
What's that? That's that.
scientific improvement, what?
that women have smaller brains? That's what you told me.
But what that means is the capacity per gram is bigger. Okay? So now, going back to another thing is, okay, sure. So everybody remembers, right? If it walks like a dog, if it talks like a dog, it is a dog, okay? So the problem with why I'm saying that phrase, when we open the letter to Hebrews, usually in the Bible, it is said that it is letter of St. Paul, or sometimes it doesn't say anything. Okay, let's see. No, in our new editions, it doesn't say. But my question is, out of all the characters that you know in the apostolic age in the New Testament, who knows sacrificial system, Old Testament theology, who had a PhD from Jerusalem State University, whose advisor was the great Gamaliel? It's Paul. Okay? So I have no problem to say, on one hand, yes, it is true, we do not know the author, but I have, on the other hand, have no problem to assume that it was Paul. There is another serious challenge with Hebrews. It doesn't look really like a letter, because in the ancient world, in the first century AD, and prior to that a little bit, and extended after that, letter would have few important characteristics, and we find those characteristics basically in all of his epistles. You have a greeting, you have a first initiative statement, and then you have kind of like, especially if it's from a person to a church, that kind of relationship. You have an idea, and then you have development of that idea, then you have some kind of conclusion, and you have a final greeting. We do have something that resembles of the final greeting over here. We have a blessing in 13:20-21, and we have a greeting in 13:22-25. Though, in 13:22-25, what we have is not necessarily part of the letter, and I don't want to say it's somebody else brought it, but what I want to say, let's open that.
Well,
The author says, I appeal, so we are in 13:22-25, in letter to Hebrews. I appeal to you, brothers, bear with my word of exhortation, for I have written to you briefly. You should know that our brother Timothy has been released, so we have a familiar name, with whom I shall see you if he comes soon. Greet all your leaders and all the saints. Those who come from Italy send you greeting. Grace be with all you. Okay? It's all great. The thing is, what is translated is I have written to you is actually could have been translated as I have sent you. So it's not necessarily a letter that he wrote to them, what I believe it is. So the letter to Hebrews from 1:1 to 13:21 was, how can I say, a presentation at pastoral conference. I know it's kind of weird to put it in our terms when we talk about Paul, most likely, who is, speaking of Italy, most likely he is still in Rome. Maybe he was already released. And he delivers the message to the leaders of the church. And we'll come to these leaders in a second. And then he also wanted to other people to read it, to hear it, to be exposed to this deep, it's a serious, deep theology. Okay? Therefore, he sends to them, it's not necessarily reading for them, it is sending to them this particular message. Okay? There is one more signal that we can pay attention to that kind of tells us that all of this is delivered to the leaders of the church, not to laymen, but to those who are in charge. If you'll go with me into Hebrews 12:15, 12:15 begins in ESV, and we can compare other translations, with the verb see. Okay? See to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, that the root of bitterness spring up and cause the trouble, and so on and so forth. The thing is, in Greek, it should have been translated oversee. It's a verbal form of the word for bishop. So, to provide oversight for the church that blah, blah, blah. That bad stuff will not happen, that the good stuff will happen. Okay? So, thinking about that particular term kind of forces me to understand or propose, let's put it this way, that again, it is a letter to the bishops of the church, and if we talked about this last few lessons, that most likely the bishops of the church are those who were responsible not only for a particular congregation, but for a territory. Okay? That would probably consist, 3, 4, 5, whatever, how many congregations. And then the elders or pastors or presbyteros in Greek, they were responsible for the congregations themselves. So I believe Paul delivered a message to those who were in charge of the bigger territories, and then they should have delivered this message to everybody else. Most likely, I would assume, they would deliver it to people who were suffering persecution in Jerusalem. So, if you can see in the handout, there is this, almost by the end of the title section, is, my personal idea, and then it's MIMHO. Everybody knows what it stands for? In my humble opinion. Seriously, in my humble opinion. I capitalize that because that's really, I'm saying this is just a proposal. That this is a presentation or exhortation of the gathering of overseers and bishops that later was distributed or sent to other regions. And as I said, the reading should be translated as sent. Putting together some other facts, most likely it was written within the period of time of 66 AD to 68 AD. The reason I am thinking that, and if you open the Lutheran Study Bible, they gave very vague answer. It's prior to 70 AD. Okay? Was it 31 AD, right after Jesus' crucifixion, or whatever the thing is?
And the reference that says 70 AD.
Unlikely. The reason I'm saying that is what happened is in 66 AD, the Jewish community in Jerusalem led a great revolt against Roman Empire. That we know that when Jesus was in Jerusalem, the temple was there. But it was somewhat not fully complete. By 66, they completed the restoration of the temple, and they thought that now, since the temple is complete, now God is truly present with them. They can overthrow the power of Roman Empire, not remembering that Jesus said that I am the temple. I mean, the holy presence, and that's the whole idea of, in the Gospel of John, we talked about that, and we will see it also in the letters of John, that in him the whole bodily presence of sacred presence is revealed. So therefore, if you have a temple, but your holy presence is given through the Messiah, then that revolt was in vain. And what we need to understand is when they led that revolt, there was somewhat a split. In the very beginning, it was kind of semi-successful, but then the Roman army with under the guiding of the general Titus came. Titus, I think so. So he came, and what they did is like, okay, I'm not going to fight with these guys because the walls of Jerusalem are really thick, and the temple itself is kind of like a fortress. What we're going to do is just besiege the city, okay? Have we heard something about if you will see this city surrounded and besieged? Yes, we did. It's in the Matthew of 23. So disciples of Jesus knew if that's going to happen, that's the end of the city. So what happened since then is, on one hand, being persecuted for believing that Jesus is the Messiah. On the other hand, what they did is when he opened the gates of the surrounding army, he opened the ways to go through the army, Messianic community, those who believe that Jesus is the Messiah, left the city. And I believe that's what Paul, again, I believe it's Paul, or author of Hebrews, encourages them to do when he says that you have not fight to the blood yet, and therefore you do not need to do it. You need to fight with sin because our fight and our main focus is not necessarily this Jerusalem, but heavenly realms where we need to pay attention to. So that's kind of our introductory thoughts. Again, I don't think it's 70 AD because temple still stands. Otherwise, all of his connections with the sacrificial system and with ideas that high priest on the annual basis comes into the Holy of Holies, they wouldn't make any sense because he puts them actually into the present tense. You can see it in, for example, 925. Let's go into 925 for a second. In chapter 9, verse 25, we see nor was it offer himself repeatedly, as the high priest enters the holy place every year with blood not of his own, and so on and so forth. So for the person who wrote letter to Hebrews, that's kind of obvious things, that those rituals are repeatedly performed in the temple. So they have no clue or they have no expectation that the temple necessarily will be destroyed. It's just not the way the people who believe that Jesus is the Messiah should worship, okay? Because we have a higher person. And that leads us to structure. You probably would be surprised if I would not come up with the chiastic structure. Of course I did. And 13 chapters you can break into 4 main points with C as kind of like attachment when he turned his speech into a letter. So we have a first greeting and we have a final blessing. And then we have 2 main parts. First part is superiority of Jesus. He points out, he goes through point by point through 5 main points of Jewish or Hebrew theology of those days. And then, based on this superiority, we are invited into faithfulness. So even though he, as the person, has had some struggles in his lively days, we will have some struggles. But regardless of that, we know he is the one. And therefore, we can overcome with our faithfulness all the obstacles. So the points that he brings up, 4, not 5. So the points of superiority are angels. It's kind of, everybody think about angels, some kind of uncreated things, or created things, but some kind of higher things. Moses, okay? Then the whole system of priesthood, and he begins with Melchizedek. We'll come to that in a second. because that's an important thing. But when you go from priesthood, you go into the whole sacrificial system and you think about the sacrifices. So Jesus, on the same hand, is the high priest who brings the sacrifice, but his sacrifice should be perfect. And no blood of the lambs or goats or bulls or whatever the thing is, no number can provide for the perfect sacrifice. Therefore, he, being the sinless guy, he is not only high priest, but also this sacrifice. Okay? And his sacrifice is superior or much better than, or it's like an ultimate sacrifice, than any of the animals. Okay? That's the first part. Then the second part is also arranged, I believe, chiastically. We have invitation to faithfulness, and then we have final exhortation. We have Old Testament examples of faithfulness, which is chapter 11, and in chapter 12, verses 14 to almost to the end of chapter 13, we have kind of negative examples and warning based on those negative examples of rejection of the will of God. And in the middle, we have one more time exclamation and speech about Jesus being the faithful one. Okay? So that's how everything is arranged, and that's how it flows. Jeff, did you have a question?
I'm waiting for you to come back with Melchizedek.
Okay, so Melchizedek. I'm not going to go over everything, but there are a few important points that we need to talk about. One of them is Melchizedek. Sometimes people are somewhat confused with who is the guy. Okay? So let's talk about that. So let's begin with a very simple thing. I think that's how you spell it. Melchizedek. Right? Something like that. Okay? What does that mean? Let's begin with the name. So Melech is the king. Okay? I is my. This is righteousness.
King of righteous.
My king is righteous.
Oh.
Okay? So my king is righteousness. It not exactly, but it's very close to the king in the times of Jeremiah, where the guy was named Zedekiah. Okay? Yahweh is righteous. But it's kind of a negative pun because he behaves like the apostate, not par excellence, but almost, very close to that. So the guy whose name is My King is Righteousness is compared, or let's reverse it, Jesus is compared to the guy who is named My King is Righteousness. Where do we find this guy? We find this guy only once in the Bible, and it's Genesis chapter 14. Okay? That's the battle between 4 kings and 5 kings. Okay? So, local, I mean, on our scale, it probably would not be local. It was somewhat big because by that time they would rule not only city-states, but some of the cities would have some kind of territories around them. So, 4 kings go against 5 kings. The one party wins, another party loses. The guys go into captivity, and then Abraham comes. And Abraham, he was not renamed yet. Abraham comes, and he wants to rescue his nephew, whose name is, what's his name of his nephew? Lot. Okay? And why he wants to rescue Lot? He wants to rescue Lot that he was captured together with one of the kings who lost the battle, the king of Sodom. Okay? Because we remember that Lot moved into Sodom area. Okay? So he couldn't care less for the kings. I mean, he cared only for his nephew. What did he do? he took 318 of his private soldiers. I mean, how cool is that? Apart, and it's not real regular, slave or servants. It's not the guys who would only, tilt the ground. Because with guys who only tilt the ground, you cannot overcome five other kings with professional army. So those guys had to be specially trained, well done, kind of like gray berets, green berets. I mean, something like that, or airborne, whatever the thing is, paratroopers, whatever you say. I mean, seriously, if you put it into our context, with this number of people, he overpowered those who took into captivity other kings. Okay? Just think about that. How rich was Abram if he could afford a private mercenaries, basically? In our current context, if you follow the news, what's going on in Ukraine, you probably have heard about Wagner, okay? Okay, here we go. Right in the Bible. And I'm not saying that these guys, it's not about good, bad, whatever the stuff is. I'm saying that who these guys are. It's not under the king. It's just under some kind of humble, guy who travels through the desert. That's how usually we are picturing him. Close enough, but not close, So he had his servants, but he was rich enough to maintain very highly efficient unit that was able to plan an attack and make that assault. So his nephew was released. Along with nephew and the kings was released king of Sodom, but also Melchizedek. Okay? And the guy comes and says, they exchange the gifts, that's where tithing 10% of income as a donation comes from, and there is a blessing and so on and so forth. Then the king of Sodom also wanted to, engage in the very same story, and Abraham said, no, from you I'm not going to take anything. Seriously, I'm just going to stay away from you. So that's, here's the bill. You can pay me for the things, but you're going to pay me, not give me. Okay? There is a big difference in the Bible between giving and paying. Okay? You can be paid by awful people if you provide services for them. Okay? Doing HVAC, I was doing systems for people who were not godly, really. And I know that. Not because they would brag about that, but for example, if you know Santa Barbara and like Montecito area, that's so if you think about there are rich people, that's where rich people live.
Montecito.
Okay? What?
Montecito.
Yeah. So some of the houses were, we would do system for people from Hollywood and from this and from that. And I know that they would brag about, pro-choice stuff and this and that and that and that. So whatever. But you can be paid, but do not receive a blessing, by gift, and stuff like that. So that's a different story. My point is, this guy is simultaneously the king, but we also know that he was a priest. So he was doing dual ministry. He was a king of his territory, and he was a main priest of his territory. And that's what Paul builds on when he says that Jesus is superior in his priesthood because he doesn't have a genealogy like Melchizedek. From that phrase, people draw an idea that Melchizedek was actually a theophany or Christophany, an appearance of God or appearance of Christ, because he just came into earth just for a little bit, as a second person of the Trinity, which is not correct. The reason Paul uses that, or author uses that, is under Levitical rule, to be a priest, what family you need to belong to. You need to be from the clan of Levi, and you need to be not only from the tribe of Levi, you have to be a descendant of Aaron. You have to be a descendant within the particular family. Unlike that, Melchizedek did not have his attachments to any of the Levitical genealogy lines, because his priesthood was prior to the establishment of Levitical priesthood in the Old Testament. Okay? So Jesus is superior priest because his priesthood is like priesthood of Melchizedek, and he bases that on Psalm 110, where God promises that you are the priest according to Melchizedek, and you will sit at the right hand of me, God says, to his minister. Okay? So it is important to understand those things. Therefore, if you will take the handouts and just turn on the other page, I kind of try to summarize reflection in the other parts of the Bible. It should have been probably renamed and like, what other parts of the Bible will help you to understand Hebrews? So to understand and fully appreciate, you can understand everything, but you would not have a deeper and fuller appreciation of the letter unless you know story of creation, role and the place of angels in the world, story of Moses, which is only books of Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Generally speaking. Of course, book of Leviticus too, but the story is in Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Structure of liturgical system, which is priests, their place, sacrifices, calendar, and so on and so forth. And the story of patriarchs, which is from Genesis 11 to 50. So this is one of the best examples that the further we go in the Bible, closer to the end, ideally, the more knowledge of the previous books we need to carry with us. I'm always surprised when people say, we need to study Revelation. Okay, I have no problem with studying Revelation. Let's spend a couple years in Genesis, 2-3 years in Leviticus, 3-4 years in Prophets. Maybe then we can begin to approach Revelation. Okay? No, it's very simple. Yeah, right. When you close your eyes, think about all the horror movie that you've seen in the from Hollywood, and then you want to interpret Revelation. Sure, yeah, you can do it that way. It's not a biblical way, but it's also a way. Okay? So, with Melchizedek, that's what it is. He is the priest, not because of the Levitical system, but he was called to be a king and the priest, and therefore, be simultaneously king and the priest. He actually combines those rules and reflects the first Adam. Because when God tells Adam to develop the land and to keep the land, that's kingly, to develop, and priestly, to keep or guard functions. Okay? So the first guy who combined in himself kingly and priestly rule, and he did not need the prophetic rule, because prophetic rule is proclaim the word of God in the very extreme situation. He did not really need it because he was not in extreme situation. He was in a perfect relationship with God in the very beginning in the garden. Okay? So only after that only after the garden, we have some prophets, and the first one is Noah. Okay? So on and so forth. So that's about Melchizedek. Any questions?
Simple. I think you answered it, but I was going to just comment, since Christ is typically considered the Old Testament manifestation of himself, Paul names him the new Melchizedek. Isn't that what we...
I am kind of confused by your phrase. Christ is considered an Old Testament manifestation. I am really not following.
Well, then I might be off a little bit here. Isn't Melchizedek, I probably phrased that improperly, isn't Melchizedek considered the physical manifestation of Christ in the Old Testament?
According to what I explained, no.
Okay.
He is a good guy. He is a righteous guy. But he is neither theophany, which is appearance of God, theophany, okay? Neither Christophany, appearance of Christ. He is a person who sets the type. That's what we build here on basis of typology. Almost every time I cannot come up with exception. It doesn't, again, when I say those things, it doesn't mean they do not exist. I don't know them. But every appearance of God, the second person of the Trinity that I know of in the Old Testament, comes as an angel. It's an angel of the Lord that appears to Moses from the fire, bush, things like that. It is an angel who comes to, what's his name? Joshua, sorry. And Joshua says, remember, right before the very important fight, and Joshua sees the guy really well, all armed, and he said, are you on our side or on their side? And the angel of the Lord says, neither. I'm on my own side, and it's better for you to be on my side, by the way. So that's the thing. He appears as an angelic being. The reason is because somebody, and we are not going to point fingers, I'm going to point with my whole palm, Adam, screwed up. And he was driven out of the garden. Now, instead of Adam, remember, he had to cultivate and protect, keep. Keep, guard, protect, the same verb, shamar. Okay? So instead of Adam, who now keeps and guards the tree of life? Cherubim, angel. Okay? So for the Old Testament, we have two important things. We have angels who are in charge of the world. If you want to see that, it's Psalm 8. Okay? In Psalm 8, it says, human beings are just below angels. Why? Because we're still in charge. But there are some other beings who are in charger of us, and that's angels in the Old Testament. Now, in John 1:14, the Word became, so Word was delivered by angels. The Word became flesh. Now human beings are in charge. Now Paul in 2 Colossians says, aren't you aware that we're going to judge the angels? So if you can judge the angels, who is in charge now? We are. Why? Because the first guy who was incarnate finally ended up to heaven as a good guy, fully good guy, and now he sits at the right hand of the Father and runs the world. So now we are able to subdue the world, angels included. That's why we have so much actually technological progress wherever the Christian faith comes. Because that's an idea. Now we are submissive. Now we are submissive, or should submit only to God. Okay, so we do not have those mediating, things, neither sacrifices in the Old Testament sense, neither angelic forces. We actually can fight, overturn the bad angelic forces. We can fight and overturn. That's the whole book of Ephesians. Not the whole, but like the last 2 chapters are about, and some other places in Corinthians, and so on and so forth. So, no, he sets the type, yes. So, generally speaking, in the Old Testament, we have people, events, or things that set the type for what kind of Messiah we should expect. Okay? We've talked about that when we discussed the book of, not the book, better to say Gospel of John. That the whole Gospel of John is basically the virtual excursion through the tabernacle or through the sacred place. Okay, because you go through the things, and what happens with Jesus is reflecting the furniture. The first thing we see is, here's the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. That's your altar. Then we have about rest of chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 dealing with water. That's your laver of cleansing. That's the second thing you see. Then you come in and you deal with bread. That's your table of the showbread. And across the table of the showbread there is a light, a lampstand. And therefore, in the 6 and 7 we deal with the bread, and then 8, 9, and 10 we deal with the light. And then in chapter 11 he prays for the resurrection of Lazarus, who is in the hiding place in the dark spot, because the altar of incense was right in front of the entrance to the Holy of Holies. Okay? So you kind of go through. So people, things, and events. So people, I told you about the things, but there are events like Exodus pattern. You have Exodus patterns in the Bible in relation of Jesus, or you have the story of creation. Let me show you one, not here, but let's go to, again, chapter 1 of John. Gospel of John. We probably will need to cut it as a separate piece, because it's more of a lesson on typology now than on Hebrews. So, Gospel of John, chapter 1. See how cool is that? In the very beginning, verse 19. This is the testimony of John when the Jews sent the priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask him, who are you? And he confessed and did not deny. He confessed, I'm not the Christ. Okay, cool. There is a dialogue, so on and so forth. Now, verse 29. The next day. So, with 1:19 to 20, we have a first day. There is a next day. It doesn't say second day, but it's next day. So it creates the idea of the next day. So from 29 to 34. What happens in 35? The next day. Okay? So the next day is 1:35 to 42. And then 4 is 1:43 till the end of the chapter, because it begins with what? Guess. The next day. Now the cool thing is, in chapter 2, I hate those chapter breaks. Honestly. What happens in chapter 2, verse 1? On the third day. On one hand, it's a third day, and John is purposefully ambiguous. On one hand, on the third day of that event. Okay? But 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 plus 3, how much will you have? 7. So what happens in the Cana of Galilee is Shabbat. Is a perfect day of rest, because he provides them with wine. You can eat bread any day, but when you have wine, you have rest. I mean, I hope none of you drink wine in the beginning of the day. Okay? That's why we don't drink and drive, You drink and rest. Okay, you have a glass of wine, and therefore, it's a time to rest. In Russian, there is a saying, what is that? Drink in the morning and you're free for a whole day. So that's the thing. So when you pay attention to these things, this is just one of the examples. You have a creation sequence. And actually, again, there are more details to that stuff. What's going on in the wedding in Cana? I just gave it up. It's a wedding, okay? So there is a man and the wife. Who didn't provide enough wine?
The host.
The man. So he's another Adam who is kind of sleeping and failing, okay? And then there is a Jesus who comes with his intervention and provides what is needed. So he restores this guy into, in so multi-level things. He restores him as the head of the household. He restores him in the social matters. Okay? And definitely he restores him, in the spiritual matters, because again, he provides for him the proper Shabbat to celebrate. Speaking of social matters, do you think in the Jewish village like Cana, anybody would forget that he was the one who failed to provide enough wine? His children, everybody would begin to learn the bike. Okay, they didn't have bikes, but everybody would begin to learn the bike. Everybody would fall and scratch their knees. But, sure they scratch their knees, because they're from the family from the guy who didn't provide the wine. That's what Jesus does. Never ever anything like that happened with that family. Why? Because there was a wine. It was given from above. Okay? And, so on and so forth. Any more questions or comments?